The Mysterious Intruder. It was a night like any other, perfect for a new piece of urban art. My friend Lucas and I decided to explore an old, abandoned railway line, a place where rusted freight cars had been left to the ravages of time. Everything was so quiet that it seemed impossible anyone else had ventured there. It was the ideal setting to leave my mark, or at least, that's what I thought. As we walked alongside the freight cars, the darkness seemed to envelop us, isolating us from the outside world. I was excited about the chance to be the first to tag that train. There wasn't a single tag in sight, as if no one had dared to approach this place before. And so, I began to work, spray can in hand, creating what I believed would be one of my best pieces. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't share the same enthusiasm. He moved away a bit, lighting up another joint while I focused on my tags. But what started as a typical night quickly turned into a nightmare. Shortly after I finished my first tag, a muffled sound echoed through the darkness. It was metallic, like something being dragged or thrown. We both froze, the silence broken only by the sound of our tense breathing. We couldn't tell where the noise was coming from, whether it was inside the train or from somewhere in the surrounding darkness. We tried to ignore it, but then it happened again. A louder, closer bang. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and a surge of adrenaline rushed through my body. Lucas was starting to get uneasy, and so was I. That's when something or someone decided that our presence there wasn't welcome. A sharp sound cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable noise of an empty spray can being hurled at us. It wasn't just the noise, there was someone there, hidden in the darkness, watching us. And they were angry. "You better not trip, kid," a voice shouted, threateningly, as the figure began to chase us. Without a second thought, we dropped everything and ran for our lives. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of our frantic footsteps, mixed with the shouts echoing behind us. Then, a gunshot rang out in the night. This wasn't just an empty threat. This person was armed and ready to use force. Lucas nearly tripped in shock, and I barely avoided falling myself. By now, my mind was a whirlwind of fear and panic, unable to focus on anything other than escape. We ran until we finally reached a main road. We didn't stop until we felt safe, a good distance away from that cursed place. My hands were trembling uncontrollably, and the silence between us was heavy. No one wanted to talk about what had just happened. Days later, curiosity, or maybe the need to confront my fears, led me back to that spot, but this time during the day, with my Glock 17 securely at my side. The train was still there, but something was different. Where my tags had once been, there were now ugly red splotches, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase my presence. But the worst was yet to come. One of the freight cars had its door slightly ajar, and something in my gut told me to stay away. But I couldn't resist and took a peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. A chair, sitting in the middle of the car, with chains and ropes scattered around it. Some wrapped around the legs of the chair, others strewn across the floor. And the smell. That strong smell of bleach, as if the entire car had been obsessively cleaned. The scene was so disturbing that I barely managed to snap a photo before hearing a metallic sound in the distance, like the echo of something moving. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I got out of there as fast as I could. To this day, I can't understand what was really going on that night, or who the person was that chased us. But one thing is certain. I've never been so terrified in my entire life. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I can still hear that gunshot echoing in my ears, reminding me that there are things in the darkness best left untouched. The Train of the Disappeared. I've always been a thrill seeker, the kind of person who chases excitement in places most wouldn't dare to go. And one of my old passions was hitching rides on freight trains. It wasn't the safest hobby, but the danger was part of what made it so addictive. It was a summer day, and I had decided to revisit an old set of tracks that my friends and I used to explore. The trees surrounding the tracks formed a kind of natural tunnel, and the only thing breaking the silence was the distant sound of an approaching train. It was the perfect place for an adventure, far from any prying eyes. I walked along the tracks, waiting to feel that familiar vibration that signals the arrival of a train. And when I finally felt it, my heart raced. I quickly moved off the tracks, hiding behind some bushes, waiting for the right moment to act. As the train passed, I picked a car that was easy to reach and ran alongside it, grabbing the metal ladder and pulling myself up. I'd done this so many times before that it was almost second nature to me. As the train picked up speed, it approached a long, dark tunnel, the kind of place where even sunlight hesitates to enter. I was already on board, so there was no turning back. The car entered the darkness of the tunnel, and suddenly, everything around me went black. And that's when it happened. Something, or rather, someone, grabbed my leg. It wasn't just a brush or a bump. It was a hand, firm and real, reaching out from the darkness and holding me tight. Panic took over, and I almost lost my balance, but I managed to keep my grip on the ladder. I screamed and kicked desperately, trying to free myself, but the train was moving too fast for me to see who, or what, was trying to pull me down. The hand let go, but the fear stayed with me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was no time to think. I knew I had to get off that train as soon as I could. When the car finally emerged from the tunnel, I jumped, landing hard on the ground as the train continued on its way. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Slowly, I got to my feet, trying to catch my breath and regain my composure. I looked back at the tunnel I had just come out of. My body was still shaking from the adrenaline, and my mind was racing. That's when I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Two silhouettes stood in the darkness, motionless, watching me. They were there, in the middle of the tracks, as still as sinister shadows. I had no idea who or what they were, but one thing was clear. They had followed me out here, and now they were just standing there, waiting. Without a second thought, I turned and started running. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening as I tried to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. But before I could completely distance myself, a terrifying scream echoed from the tunnel. It was the most inhuman sound I had ever heard, a sound that carried with it an almost palpable despair. It wasn't just a scream, it was a wail, as if the souls of those who had disappeared on that train were trying to reach me. I finally reached my car and threw myself inside, my heart still pounding uncontrollably. I drove in silence, fear still coursing through my veins, as I tried to push the images and sounds from my mind. To this day, I don't know what that hand was that tried to pull me into the darkness, or who those figures in the tunnel were. But one thing is certain. I'm never going near a freight train again, and the sound of that scream still haunts me every night. There are places in this world where people disappear, and maybe, just maybe, I got too close to finding out what really happens to them. The Voice in the Darkness. The New York City subway is a place with a life of its own, pulsing beneath the city that never sleeps. For me, it was just another night at work, another night immersed in the routine of maintenance deep within the stations. I had been at it for a few years, and things had become, in a way, predictable. Until that night. I was at High Street Station in Brooklyn, an old, dimly lit station like so many others. It was late, and the place was completely deserted, a disturbing contrast to the crowds that usually fill those tunnels. The silence was almost total, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional distant rumble of a passing train. That's when I heard it. A strange sound, a metallic clatter that echoed off the tunnel walls. It was as if a stone had been thrown against the tracks, something that shouldn't be happening there, not at that hour. The noise caught me off guard, making me drop my mop in shock. I looked toward the tunnel, trying to figure out what could have caused it. I waited, but nothing happened. I convinced myself it was probably just a piece of concrete falling, Or maybe some animal wandering through the tunnel. The station was old, after all, and these sounds were unusual but not impossible. I went back to work, trying to ignore the growing unease settling in the pit of my stomach. But then, about 10 minutes later, the sound came again. Only this time louder, closer. It was impossible to ignore now. I dropped everything and walked to the edge of the tunnel, my heart beginning to beat faster. I peered into the darkness, trying to see something, but all I could make out was a black void, an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. For a moment, I considered shouting, asking if anyone was there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was a dark intuition, but I decided to stay silent. Something wasn't right. As I pondered what to do, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's voice, weak and desperate, called out for help. "Help!" it cried, the voice echoing off the tunnel walls. At first, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A child? Here? In the middle of the night? My mind struggled to process the situation. Was I imagining things? But then the voice called out again, and this time there was no doubt. Someone was in there, a child, asking for help. My conscience wouldn't allow me to ignore it. With a mix of fear and responsibility, I climbed down onto the tracks, my footsteps echoing softly in the oppressive silence. I called out to the child, asking where they were. "I'm right in front of you," the voice replied, but I could see nothing but shadows. I kept walking, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, and then, finally, there they were. A small figure of a child, standing in the middle of the tracks. But something wasn't right. Something about the way they stood there, so still, so wrong. Before I could comprehend it, I saw another shadow. A larger figure, much larger, standing next to the child like a sinister guardian. My heart raced. It was an adult, someone who was there, waiting, watching. Fear paralyzed me for a second, but then stronger instincts took over. I slowly turned, trying not to draw attention, and began to back away. "Where are you going?" the child's voice called out again, now with a sense of urgency that made me quicken my pace. I climbed back onto the platform as quickly as I could, without looking back. I knew I couldn't stay there another second. I ran to the service phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had just happened. When the police arrived, they searched the tunnel for hours. They found only a single child's shoe, lying alone in the middle of the tracks. There was no sign of the boy or the shadowy figure with him. Nothing. To this day, the mystery of that encounter haunts me. Who was that child? Who was the adult with them? And why were they there, in that deep darkness? The only theory that makes any sense is that someone was using the boy as bait, trying to lure an unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a deadly trap. But even that explanation doesn't ease the fear I feel every time I pass by that station. There are things in the New York subway that go beyond comprehension, things that watch us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear that voice in the darkness, calling for help. But I know that if I answer, I might not make it back next time. The encounter with the unknown. Being a graffiti artist means living in the shadows, marking the world with your art and slipping into places most people avoid. But some nights, those that start out ordinary, can quickly turn into something you'll never forget. And that's exactly what happened on this night. It was a day like any other, and I was on the hunt for a new spot to leave my mark. I found an old, abandoned freight train, rusted and forgotten on a disused railway line. The kind of place where no one would care if I left my art. Or at least, that's what I thought. I brought my friend Lucas along, even though he was never as enthusiastic about graffiti as I was. He was there more for the company, and to be honest, it was nice to have someone around in that kind of isolated place. As I prepared to start, Lucas lit up a joint and wandered off a bit, leaving me immersed in my work. The train was completely empty, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. I began to work, spray can in hand, the familiar sound of paint hissing into the silent night. The first tag was almost finished when I heard something. A strange noise, like a metallic echo coming from somewhere far off. I paused for a second, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but everything was quiet again. I tried to ignore the discomfort growing inside me and continued painting. But after a few more minutes, the sound came back. This time, louder, closer. It was as if something was moving, creeping between the cars, or maybe inside one of them. The feeling of being watched was undeniable. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed, followed by the unmistakable sound of a spray can rolling on the ground. Lucas and I froze. In that moment, we knew we weren't alone. Someone was there, watching us, and they weren't happy with our presence. The silence was broken by a voice, rough and threatening, "You better not trip, kid." Before we could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, chasing us. This wasn't just a warning, it was a real threat. And as if that wasn't enough, a gunshot rang out in the night, the sound slicing through the air like a sharp blade. That's when survival instinct kicked in. We dropped everything and ran as fast as we could, fear pulsing through our veins. The sound of the unknown figure's footsteps followed us, and for a moment, the only thing that existed was the need to escape. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a main road. We didn't stop until we were sure we were far enough away from that cursed place. When we finally calmed down, we sat in silence, the terror still evident on our faces. No one said a word. What had happened was so surreal it felt more like a nightmare than reality. But something inside me, maybe curiosity or the desire to confront my fears, made me return to that spot a few days later. Only this time, I came prepared. I returned during the day, with my Glock 17 strapped to my waist as a way to protect myself from the unknown. The train was still there, sitting in the same spot, as if it had been waiting for me. But something was different. Where my tags had been, there were now red stains, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase my work. The scene was disturbing, but I hadn't come back to retreat. I continued to explore, and then I found something that made my blood run cold. One of the cars had its door slightly open. Inside, in the middle of the empty car, there was a solitary chair, surrounded by chains and ropes. Some of them were wrapped around the chair's legs, others scattered haphazardly across the floor. And the smell. The strong smell of bleach was so intense it almost made me gag. It was as if someone had desperately tried to clean something up, to erase any evidence of whatever had happened there. I knew I shouldn't stay any longer. But as I was backing away, I heard a metallic sound in the distance, like something moving inside the train. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I got out of there as fast as I could, my heart still racing. To this day, I can't understand what happened that night. Who was that person who chased us? What was going on inside that car? And why was someone so determined to erase my tags? These questions still haunt me, but one thing is certain. I'm never going back to that place again. There are mysteries that should remain hidden, places where the unknown reigns. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, I can still hear that rough voice, whispering threats in the darkness. That was the last tag I ever did on that train, and maybe the last I'll ever do in my life. The Subway Psychopath. Working in the New York City subway system gets you used to the unexpected. After a few years on the job, you start to think you've seen it all, that nothing can surprise you anymore. But the truth is, down there, in those dark, empty tunnels, there are secrets the surface will never know. And that night, I discovered one of those secrets in the worst possible way. It was just another night at work, or at least, it should have been. I was on duty at High Street Station in Brooklyn, doing routine maintenance. The station was completely empty, a disturbing silence filling the space where there would normally be the noise and rush of crowds. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and, occasionally, the distant rumble of a passing train. I was almost done with my shift when I heard something that shouldn't have been there, a metallic sound like something had fallen onto the tracks. It was a strange noise, one that cut through the station's silence and made my heart beat a little faster. In that moment, I thought it might have just been a piece of concrete that had come loose, or maybe some animal that had wandered onto the tracks. But the truth was far different. About 10 minutes later, the sound came again, this time louder and closer. It was impossible to ignore now. I abandoned what I was doing and walked to the edge of the platform, looking into the dark tunnel. The darkness inside seemed like an endless abyss, and a deep instinct within me said I should stay away. As I tried to decide what to do, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a child's voice, weak and desperate, crying for help. "Help!" it pleaded, echoing off the tunnel walls. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then the voice came again, and there was no doubt it was real. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just turn my back on a child in danger. I climbed down onto the tracks, my flashlight illuminating only a few feet ahead, leaving the rest of the tunnel shrouded in darkness. I walked slowly, adrenaline rushing through my body as I called out to the child. "I'm right in front of you," the voice responded, but still, there was nothing in sight. I kept walking, my heart pounding harder with each step. Finally, my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and there, in the middle of the tracks, I saw it. A small figure of a child, standing almost motionless. But something was very wrong. Something about the way they were standing there, so still, so out of place. That's when I realized they weren't alone. Beside the child, a much larger silhouette stood out, an adult figure, looming like a sinister shadow, watching, waiting. Terror gripped me. This wasn't just a lost child, it was a trap. I did the only thing my instincts allowed. I slowly backed away, trying not to draw attention to my panic. "Where are you going?" the child's voice called out, now tinged with an urgency that made my skin crawl. I climbed back onto the platform as quickly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't wait to see if they followed. I ran to the service phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had just happened. The police arrived quickly, and soon they were scouring the tunnel. I hoped they would find something, anything to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But all they found was a single child's shoe, lying alone on the tracks. There was no sign of the child, nor the adult who was with them. It was as if they had evaporated into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night trying to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. Who was that adult? And why were they using a child to lure someone into the tunnel? The only explanation that made any sense was the most disturbing of all. Someone was using that child as bait, trying to lure an unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a deadly trap. But the most terrifying thing is that, even after all that, the mystery remained. The police never found the boy or the adult. The investigation led nowhere, and the story remained etched only in my memory, a haunting reminder of something I couldn't fully understand. Now, whenever I go back to work in the subway, there's always a part of me that stays on high alert, waiting to hear that voice in the darkness again. But I know that if I ever do hear it, I might not be so lucky next time. There are things in the tunnels that should never be found, shadows that hunt in the darkness, waiting for those who dare to enter their territory. And that day, I came too close to becoming another victim of the subway psychopath.